Okay, yeah. Happy to be here. I'm Tom Williams from Colorado School of Mines. I'm a computer scientist and a cognitive scientist. So we work in a weird sort of interdisciplinary research area, human-robot interaction, which means I study how we can better design interactive robots that can genuinely enhance the capabilities of communities. Specifically, I work in an area called social robotics, where robots are being used in domains like eldercare and education. And these robots are going to have a lot of power once they're actually out in the world. And this is because social robots are defined by their ability to take social actions. And social actions necessarily engage in human social power dynamics in order to manipulate human dispositions. This sounds scary. Manipulating human dispositions. Why are people doing this? Well, in social robotics, people do this because we might want to persuade, for example, seniors to take their medicine, persuade kids to engage in educational activities, persuade people in therapy to actually perform physical therapy exercises. This inherently requires manipulation. And yes, this has a dark side, right? We know that, for example, we have a paper at HRI we'll be presenting next week, for example, where we show that just getting advice from robots creates a significant moral burden to follow that advice. People blame people much more for disobeying robots' advice, whatever the advice is, than they would blame people for taking the morally inappropriate action. Scary. There's a long history of work showing that people dramatically overtrust robots and will put themselves at risk in order to follow the instructions or advice that they're getting from robots. So this is a real safety concern. Moreover, my lab has shown that robots can also inadvertently exert negative moral influence on people. So this isn't just about designing robots to wield persuasion positively, but also about designing robots to avoid accidentally wielding negative persuasion. This type of persuasiveness is specifically a form of interpersonal power, and understanding how and why robots wield interpersonal power is thus critical to the ethical and responsible design of social robots. My lab has been working to develop frameworks that help us to understand how and why exactly robots wield persuasive power so we can design robots that wield it more effectively. And our lab has, again, as a computer and cognitive scientist, we do a lot of robot architecture research, exploring how robot software architectures can be redesigned to prevent robots from exerting negative moral persuasive influence. However, when we discuss power in robotics, roboticists tend to be too narrowly focused on the power that roboticists wield over people during interactions. In contrast, Katie Winkle, who is a social roboticist from Sweden. Funny story here. Katie, coming from the UK, was originally supposed to come and do a postdoc with me, had paperwork signed, pandemic hit, couldn't get a visa, went to Sweden instead. But the cool thing that came out of that work is she developed this theory of feminist human-robot interaction, where she took inspiration from some of the things our lab was doing, combined it with some of this feminist scholarship coming out of Sweden, and developed this new framework for analyzing, encouraging roboticists to think about these larger networks of power relationships that are at play beyond just the human and the robot. So the institutions, bystanders, the researchers, the research team, funding agencies, and so forth. And she argues in her theory that we should be working to challenge inequitable power structures by things like rethinking binaries and hierarchies, embracing pluralism, taking a participatory approach, making labor visible, and so forth. So to see how these principles can be put into practice in HRI, let me present as an example a current collaboration I have with folks here in Atlas. So this is specifically the PeerBots project. This is a social, so PeerBots is a social robotics nonprofit started by Atlas affiliate Aubrey Schick. My PhD student Saad is on the board, so full disclosure, he's on the board of this organization. He's been asked to be their next executive director, but he's currently trying to finish his PhD, so we'll see what happens with that. PeerBots doesn't design robots. They design software that allows people to remotely control robots. So their software works on things like Misty, which is from here in Boulder, or like cute other types of robots that are used in various contexts. And they developed teleoperation software that allows therapists or special educators to remotely control what this robot says and log the information that comes from these robots. These interfaces are then used in therapy and education. So here is a therapist who's remotely controlling this mystery robot as it interacts with this group of kids. And so the question we have here is how can we ethically and responsibly design these interfaces for controlling the robots? So a traditional human-robot interactions perspective would say, well, human-robot interaction, let's focus on the child and the interaction. In contrast, a feminist approach might also consider the stakeholders, like parents, administrators, insurance companies, and what we call the care wizards, who are actually mediating these interactions. So the approach our lab has been taking to develop interfaces for these care wizards reflects a feminist stance in a couple different ways. So first off, in terms of embracing pluralism, inherently while most human-robot interaction focuses on autonomy, I think that our approach to embracing teleoperation, while it's not as interesting to the artificial intelligence community, is actually really important from sort of a pluralist perspective. And as such, we've been working to understand from that perspective why these care wizards really value teleoperation. We've been working with therapists and special educators to understand why they use teleoperated robots and to understand the control, the agency, and the effectiveness that it gives them. These efforts have enabled SOD to develop fundamentally new frameworks for reasoning about therapy and for understanding how different technological innovations can be used to enhance different parts of that therapeutic process. And this, in turn, has informed the design of new tools that we've developed for care wizards. Second, through this process, we've been explicitly working to try to make labor visible. So SOD has worked, for example, to understand the ways that invisible labor manifests in care wizard workflows. He's been creating automated tools to reduce that invisible labor, and he's been creating new design tools that will help to make care wizard labor more visible during the technology design process. And we've been exploring a variety of participatory approaches. So my master's student Shane Romero, for example, took a participatory approach to designing interfaces for authoring content and analyzing session outcomes involving multiple studies with iterative participatory design with different types of stakeholders. And my student Taryn has used PeerBot, we can see it in this screenshot here, as part of these larger participatory design activities that help to better understand kids' ethical concerns. And this is work she did with kids at an urban forest school in Denver, an entirely outdoor school, doing participatory work with them. It was super fun. Finally, we've been working to challenge hierarchies by acknowledging the range of expertise among care wizards, making sure that we're not just designing for experts, but also ensuring that novice and less formally credentialed users' needs are also met. And we've been working overall to integrate these types of perspectives into this overarching robotics for social justice framework, and we'll be presenting on this at HRI next week as well. However, I also think that as we move beyond this narrow focus on the interaction and consider these broader issues of power, it's important to consider other types of power beyond this interpersonal power. So what other types of power do roboticists wield? So this is where I think that the Matrix of Domination from Black Feminist Thought can provide a really helpful path forward. Originally presented by Patricia Hill Collins, the Matrix of Domination thinks about these different domains of power that are used to structure, manage, and reinforce different types of oppression within our society: interpersonal, cultural, disciplinary, and structural. So in this talk, what I'm going to do, really, now that we're into it, is I'm going to explore how roboticists also wield a cultural and disciplinary power and show how identifying these sources of power helps us to more effectively employ feminist design in order to challenge inequitable power structures. The framework I'll be using is Matrix-Guided Technology Power Analysis, which is a framework I've developed that I'll also be presenting at HRI next week. It's also the framework that guides my forthcoming book from MIT Press. Hopefully it'll be out this year, maybe early 2025. We'll see. So walking through, I'm going to start with cultural power. So cultural power is the ability to impact the underlying norms, biases, stereotypes, and assumptions that are used to justify oppression in our society. So I'll start with a little story. When I was a PhD student at Tufts University, we used to go up all the time to events at the Nerve Center. It's basically a big robot playground at UMass Lowell. And as I started reading about the history of the relationship between technology and race and power in America, something that came up was some quotes from the journal of Ralph Waldo Emerson when he visited Lowell. I was like, I've been to Lowell. In fact, we went here so many times, our lab slowly became full of UMass Lowell mugs we've gotten for free. So visiting our lab, you would have thought it was at Lowell and not Tufts. And I started thinking about, well, this site we went to, what used to be there before it was a robotics center? And it turns out it was the foundry for the Lowell machine shop. Really exciting. Actually, really interesting. So for those of you not in, how many of you know the history of Lowell, Massachusetts? Oh my God, 1.5. That's like a big percentage. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, in the 19th century, Lowell was a mill town and one of the big US industrial centers, right? And what this means is the foundry for the Lowell machine shop was where they were creating the equipment for the Lowell mills, which was processing 33 million person hours of slave labor a year. So the Lowell machine shop was creating the technology that was facilitating the United States slave economy and allowing Massachusetts to participate in that economy while saying, we don't have slaves here. Or at least, that's what Lowell did until 1863, when slavery was to some extent abolished nationwide. Lowell did fine. The mills found other sources of cotton. Eventually, the mills were repurposed into things that initially might look unconnected, as we'll see, maybe some deeper connections. But as the industrial North was pivoting, the South was in crisis. The abolition of slavery didn't just devastate the Southern economy, the entire Southern power structure was grounded in slavery. And this is what the Matrix of Domination is typically used to help us reason about. So in the structural domain, the South created slave codes to hierarchically structure their society along lines of enslavement. In the disciplinary domain, slave patrols were set up to enforce the slave codes. In the cultural domain, a system of race was created to justify the codes. And in the interpersonal domain, all of these things led Southern white men to feel entitled to certain treatment. The end of slavery thus posed an intense existential crisis among white men in the American South. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what are we talking about? I thought we were going to be talking about robots. But the reason why this is important is because this existential crisis was a key factor in shaping robot design. So this is a patent from 1868, possibly the first robot patent in the US. They weren't called robots at that point. But what we see is this mechanical man wearing a top hat, smoking a pipe, pulling his cart. So why was this robot designed this way? Well, the reason is because it was modeled after the second most popular character in popular culture at the time. Specifically, it was modeled after Zip Coon, which was a character in minstrel shows at the time. So this proto-robot was designed in the caricature of a black man in ways that intersect with specific race and class elements that played into that caricature. This patent immediately inspired the first appearance of robots in literature, which is this book. This is for the cover, The Steam Man of the Prairies. How many of you have heard of this book? Okay, so premise. We have this white boy who uses this black mechanical man to carry him and his friends westward. Boy ultimately blows up the mechanical man to slaughter some Native Americans, steals the Native Americans' horses, returns home. Child and his friends are financially and sexually successful. Whoa. Okay. So Taylor Evans is a literary scholar from Riverside who a couple of years ago wrote a dissertation on this topic. I did not discover this, rediscover this book. And Evans argues that this story has a clear message. It was that white men could no longer master black slaves, but they could instead master technology in order to violently expand westward. And the mechanical black slave here was a symbol for this possible future for Southern white boys of how they could maintain their hegemonic power with the end of the Civil War. This book was wildly influential. It spawned this whole genre of early science fiction literature, these Edisonades, both in the US and in Europe, including this book, Le Futur, which expanded on this image in interesting ways. So while the Steam Man of the Prairies had this mechanical black man as a symbol for how white men could maintain power at the end of black slavery, Le Futur used this mechanical white woman as a symbol for how white men could maintain power with the rise of the women's suffrage movement in France. And these are important because of the ways that they influenced what we typically view as the cultural touchstone of robotics that shape what new roboticists think of when they think about robots. So the first is Rawson's Universal Robots, this play by Czech playwright Karel Čapek that came out in 1920. People will often note that, so this is where the word robot comes from, and that the word robot in Czech means slave, or this particular type of forced labor. But if we understand this history, we can say, well, of course Čapek used this word. He was building on this half century of artificial person and slave metaphor. But he was expanding the mechanical slave metaphor to capture these broader white labor concerns. As an aside, I think this is also important because people focus a lot on the word robot in this title, but I think the word universal is just as important because these robots in this play are not meant to universally serve everyone. However, there is this sort of joint struggle across race and gender and class in the play that is really important for the play, but not acknowledged when we think about robots today. This is also important because of the ways that it influenced Asimov. Asimov hated this play, did not like these uprising narratives, and so he instead wrote his stories about how best to keep artificial slaves in line through a set of slave codes, or his 3 laws of robotics. So what we see here then is that over the course of this literature, robots becoming more moving away. That's annoying. Moving away from visibly depicting black men, the image getting whitened, and in Asimov's stories we have the robots quoting HMS Pinafore, very white-coated, while while maintaining their status as in terms of what they're actually doing as slaves serving white men. And we see this also. So Ruha Benjamin, who's speaking here on Wednesday, super excited for this. She has this example in her book Race After Technology. In the 1950s, of as these robots are moving into the world, how they are depicted to the public. And the quote from this popular science article is, in 1863, Abe Lincoln freed the slaves, so by 1965, slavery will be back. We will all have personal slaves again, only this time we won't fight a civil war over them. Slavery will be here to stay. So very specific vision of who is being included here, who robots are for, and that's also depicted in the imagery that was used to accompany it. You might say, okay, well, this is all science fiction. Again, we're trying to understand how we're designing concrete robots today as engineering products, right? Well, this is important because of the way that it shaped early engineering practice. Norbert Wiener, creator of cybernetics, amateur science fiction writer, tried to collaborate with Asimov, didn't go well. The creators of the Unimate, the first industrial robot arm, created it because they wanted to make Asimov stories a reality. And these early engineers were still really aware of the connections in what they were doing. Norbert Wiener said in one of his books, let's remember that the automatic machine, whatever we think of any feelings it may or may not have, is the precise economic equivalent of slave labor. Okay, you might say this is still pretty, in the history of robotics, computer science, still pretty ancient history, right? So we might ask, is robotics today still primarily shaped by white male aspirations? Yes. Okay. So one way we can see this is the ways that today's social robots are being advertised. So Jibo, famous, if you're not familiar, came out of MIT, famously failed because it came out at the same time as Alexa. So pour one out for Jibo. But Jibo was advertised in its original video as fitting the needs of this very heteronormative white family, and even as helping to satisfy the sexual desires of its white male owner. There's a scene in the advertisement where Jibo plays wingman. For its owner, very strange, but it says a lot about who was designing the robot, who they were envisioning it being used by. Today, most humanoid robots, real and imaginary, fall into 2 categories. We have either very white and masculine robots in traditionally masculine domains, or when robots are being built to reflect how roboticists would like to see themselves, or we have very white and feminine robots in traditionally feminine domains, or even outside of robotics and things like voice assistants, which also when robots are being built to be sexualized. So this is the case of sexual robots. Also, I would argue in the case of this space exploration robot, I took this picture. I asked the person standing next to it why they chose to give this robot a visible chest. They said it was so we could fit more computer chips in. I don't think so. I don't think that's why they designed the robot this way. I think this says something about who was designing the robot and what the sexual preferences and aesthetics of those designers were. Okay, you might say this seems pretty limited to US and European contexts, right? So yes, those robots are European, but even outside the United States and Europe, specifically white male aspirations are playing a key role in shaping what robots look like today and how they're deployed. My favorite example of this is Enki. So this is a robot designed for South Korean English language classrooms, presented as this autonomous robot with a white feminine avatar. In fact, teleoperated behind the scenes by Filipino women. The facial expressions of these Filipino women mapped onto the animated white avatar of this robot. This is partly due to the history of American imperialism in East and Southeast Asia. As Ana Ramiro Guevara talks about in 2015, American American imperialism in that region simultaneously meant that Filipino women were best positioned to be performing this type of instruction, but that, quote, attractive young white women were perceived as the correct English instructors. You might say, well, okay, well, what about robots in places like Japan? There's a lot of really humanoid robots coming out of Japan, very clearly not like, in these exact dynamics. And yes, of course, not all humanoid robots fall into these categories, but even outside the United States and Europe, robots are being built according to the same logics. Example, 2 robots from Hiroshi Ishiguro. Here is Hiroshi and his Geminoid robot. Clearest possible example of a roboticist building a robot in their image. That's the motivation for this design. Here we have the Erica robot from the same lab. The motivation is clear. It's in the paper. They say, we found pictures of 30 beautiful women so that the robot would appeal equally to everyone. Where everyone here is doing a lot of work. It says something about who was on that design team and who they were envisioning the robot being designed for. Now, okay, you might also say lots of interactive robots today don't seem to embody these visibly racialized or gendered characters. So Tiago robot from HAL, right? I mean, it's sort of humanoid. I guess it's white in the sense of it's white plastic, but not visibly like racialized or gendered the same way, right? The problem is that this type of white patriarchal design is not always visible. As we're talking today about interactive robots, as soon as the robot starts speaking, people are going to racialize and gender it based off of its prosody, lexical choice, syntax, pragmatics. And so for language-capable robots, this may be unavoidable. The next time you see a video of an interactive robot, think about whether it's speaking in standardized American English, and think about the gendering of its voice and how that might align with the domain it's being used in. Okay, so maybe robots are being designed in ways that are gendered and racialized. If we're talking about stereotypes, though, this doesn't necessarily mean that people will stereotype them, right? Well, let me give an example from my lab's own work. So one of the things my lab works on is moral cognition in robots, designing robots that detect norm violations, say no. So you ask the robot to do something wrong, how should it say no? Turns out we found people care a lot about proportionality. They want robots to be proportionately harsh. You shouldn't yell at somebody for minor violation and vice versa. So putting on our UX UI designer cap, how are we design this robot, right? Well, let's just phrase the robot's rebukes in whatever way people consider most proportionately harsh, right? We'll ask a bunch of people, what do they think is best? That's what we'll do. The problem with that is we found in follow-up studies that people, especially men, don't like feminine presenting robots shown rejecting commands. This is overt sexism. In addition, both men and women don't like robots that are shown rejecting commands that are coming from feminine presenting humans. This is perhaps benevolent sexism. So if roboticists are designing robots to rebuke commands in whatever way people say they most approve of, they will inadvertently be producing robots that play into these norms of overt and benevolent sexism. Okay, so end of the line. Robots are designed in ways that reflect and evoke white patriarchal stereotypes. How do roboticists reinforce the stereotypes that are used to justify oppression? So we can see this if we look at the whole cycle of things we've talked about. So we've got predominantly white and male robot designers who are designing robots in service of white and male values and designing robots for the white male gaze. This reinforces stereotypes about what robots are and what they should look like, about who robot designers are, and about who the humans are that the robots are being designed to depict. And this feeds back and leads to more robots that look the way they do today, that lead to increasingly homogeneous populations of robot designers, and increasingly to more and more robots that are being built explicitly in service of white male values. So what do? Again, my argument is that we can subvert some of these trends once we've identified these social and historical factors by following these same types of feminist design principles. So one approach is we can rethink binaries through cross-stereotypic design. So Katie Winkle, once she got to Sweden, one of the first projects she worked on was this robot here. It's explicitly feminine presenting, but she studied how it could push back on observed sexism in ways that was much harsher than was expected according to sort of the gendered expectations in the local cultural context. So explicitly subverting some of these gendered norms. Afterwards, I worked with Katie as well as researchers in Japan to cross-culturally replicate some of her results. And we found that, yes, across these different cultures, feminine presenting robots that assertively were calling out sexism in ways that sort of went against local cultural norms were not just successful in subverting those norms, but were also viewed as more credible by both men and women who were observing them. In addition, another approach we've been taking is rethinking binaries through agender design. So this is an approach from one of my students, a former master's student, Michael Stoltz-Smith. I'll be presenting it on his behalf at HRI next week. Sad story about this paper. It was nominated for a Best Paper Award, but I'm one of the program chairs, so I had to eliminate it from consideration. So who knows? But very cool new work from our lab. So I teach robot ethics, and one of the things we talk about every year is this exact problem. And the idea that, well, should we be gendering robots if they're evoking stereotypes? And Mike was in my class last year, and he raised this point that, well, there are more options in robot design between just masculine, feminine, and let's avoid gender entirely. Mike identifies as non-binary, uses he, them pronouns, and he pointed out that many other non-binary people, not himself, but many others, identify as agender. What if robots were designed that way as well? There's a big difference between designing robots in a way that we're saying we're not going to think about gender versus designing robots to depict an agender character. And Mike argued that the human-robot interaction research literature has historically paid little attention to transgender and non-binary perspectives. So we said, all right, let's talk to other trans and non-binary people and find out what they think about robot gender and agender robot design. So he designed this robot character using the MISTI and chose a name, a voice, and pronouns that aligned with this design. He then showed the users videos of this robot and engaged them in semi-structured interviews. And here are just a couple of the things he found. So first, nearly everybody eventually perceived Wynn as agender, as opposed to not having gender. And he argued that this meant that, yes, agender design could be a promising path forward if we want to avoid descriptions of masculinity and femininity in our robot design. In addition, participants were overall optimistic about the use of agender design to avoid reinforcing patriarchal gender roles and creating opportunities for exposure to non-cis identities. So agender design could be a way that our community helps to normalize things like pronoun use. However, people had some concerns. One thing was people were concerned about dehumanization. If all of our robots have this agender identity, then will that lead people to associate this type of identity with a robotic nature? Will this dehumanize actual non-binary people? And this emphasizes the need, again, to take a pluralist approach and avoid sort of universal solutions. In addition, participants were concerned about rainbow capitalism. If Google says we're coming out with the first gay robot, you might have some concerns about that, right? And I think this emphasizes the need for participatory approaches that are genuinely engaging with communities. In future work, one of the things that we are looking to do is look how we could further subvert patriarchal power in educational contexts through cross-stereotypic and agender design. So we have a proposal under review to explore this with participatory design work around these types of gender identities with female cadets at the Air Force Academy. In addition, our lab, in a couple sort of weirder directions, our lab has done a variety of research exploring how robots can break assumptions about the relationship between body and identity. We've explored how people perceive robots that make use of their ability for telepathy with each other transparent. We've explored how people trust or distrust robots whose minds hop between different bodies. We've explored how to communicate robots' individualistic or hive mind status through robot design, and we've explored different design metaphors and how they can be used to convey the presence of remote robots through augmented reality. In future work, we're interested in exploring how these different design patterns, which demonstrate the ability of robot identity to be performed in fundamentally different ways within and between bodies, might be used to subvert traditional assumptions about the nature of human identity. Moreover, we're interested in exploring how tools might be created that allow communities to design identities for themselves without roboticist involvement. So this is like an end-user programming approach motivated by Sasha Kostanchuk's theory of design justice. This work would build on our existing body of work on using augmented reality in human-robot interaction, where we have rich experience developing robots that are partially physical and partially virtual, and where we have rich experience studying both the objective performance, the subjective benefits, and the neurophysiological effects of these types of designs This is work we've done with Leanne Hirschfield here at CU, who is my oldest collaborator. She was my research mentor when I was an undergrad. In future work, we see rich opportunities for using similar techniques to enable communities to rapidly prototype and design identity-laden virtual facets of robots that will be embedded into their communities. Okay, so that's cultural power. Now I'll talk about disciplinary power. So this is the power to enforce the rules of the game that manage oppression through the ways that robots are enforcing racial and gendered logics and norms. So last year I had a paper at HRI where I argued that robots are reinforcing white supremacist and patriarchal logics through the ways that they algorithmically sort people into categories of race and gender. It's very common right now to have in social robot APIs to have functions that basically play guess the gender of the person I'm looking at, and there are increasing calls. There is momentum towards robots guessing the race of people, as we see more and more people saying, oh, our robots should look at people, guess what culture they're from, and then be culturally sensitive to them. Something that inherently requires guessing this type of information from visual characteristics. And I argue that robots that algorithmically sort people into binary gender categories or specific racial categories reinforce these white and patriarchal power dynamics in the disciplinary domain. My work here directly builds off of some really cool work from CU, from InfoSci, from Morgan Cloud Scheuermann, which if you haven't read their work on this in the computer vision domain, is really powerful. One of the things that Morgan did was analyze computer vision data sets and look at what are the categories that computer vision researchers are using to categorize people in terms of race and gender. And no surprises, it's not great. The worst example I think they found was Microsoft's celebrity database, where Microsoft is classifying faces of celebrities as either Caucasian, Mongoloid, or Negroid, which are like these horrific 19th century pseudoscience categories. And part of the point here is that Microsoft, in doing so, was implicitly asserting that people can and should be sorted into these categories. Moreover, though, I think it's important to recognize that different countries have different racial architectures and different common sense, meaning that how you are racialized changes as you move around within the world. What this means is that robots, regardless of what categories robots are actually using to do this, they risk reinforcing and globalizing the categories that their designers have chosen to use as those robots are disseminated around the world. I think this is also important in the context of the literature on biometric surveillance technologies from Simone Brown. So if you haven't read Simone Brown's fantastic book, Dark Matters, she talks about the history of biometric surveillance technologies like slave brands, early non-computer vision databases, non-computer databases, racialized ID cards like driver's licenses, and computer vision technologies, and talks about how computer vision technologies are fitting into that history of similar technologies. And I think there's a real risk in robotics of our robots being designed in a way that fits into this history as well. So robots' disciplinary power here is also reflected through the ways that they are directly enforcing white and patriarchal norms. So I have a strong history of work on developing robots that can understand and generate polite language. So you say to the robot, like, can you get me a coffee? And it doesn't just say yes. It goes and gets you the coffee, right? I also have done a lot of work on encouraging robots to be polite and on robots that encourage humans to be polite. So which is a big concern in areas like Amazon is very concerned about this, like is Alexa encouraging kids to interact impolitely with people. Similarly, we've done a lot of work on enabling robots to follow moral norms and to communicate moral norms, like the norm violation response work that I talked about, where inherently, in order to decide how to respond to a norm violation, you have to answer questions like, how severe is the norm violation I observed, and how strong should the robot's response be? So all of this work is focused on norms and how to enforce them. As I said before, if robots are designed to adhere to just whatever norms people hold, this will result in robots that behave in a sexist way and may reinforce sexist attitudes. So that's interpersonal cultural power. In addition, though, this very directly may lead to robots policing and enforcing white patriarchal norms of behavior. And this is power wielded in the disciplinary domain. This is really serious in the real world contexts where robots are being deployed, like education. people have already been, so I think that educational robots is one of the most promising areas for the field of human-robot interaction where we can actually do a lot of good. However, some people have already been developing educational robots that check student IDs or attendance, check school uniforms, and look out for disruptive behaviors. Again, calling out sexism is important for robots to do because if they don't, people will view it as tacit condoning of that behavior. However, I think that these types of rule checking should make us really nervous and need to be approached through a community-oriented social justice lens because of the effects these rules already have when they are enforced by humans. So 200,000 students per year are referred to law enforcement for in-school behaviors in the United States, and these commonly include truancy, uniform violations, and ostensibly disruptive behaviors. As a result, Black and Indigenous students are disproportionately more likely to have their absences deemed unexcused and referred to the legal system. Black students comprise 1/3 of in-school arrests and are 3 times more likely to be suspended. And due to both of these factors, Black students disproportionately end up in the juvenile justice system. So this means that if our robots are automatically detecting and reporting violations of white masculine norms of appropriate behavior, they may exacerbate the rate that Black children end up in prison and exacerbate economic disparity among racial groups. Hopefully, we can agree that this is not something we want to happen out of our robot design. So to understand how these trends can be avoided, we again should be working to understand what are the historical and social forces that led to our current status quo, and how can we subvert those historical trends? My argument here is that our current status quo of morally competent robots encoding and enforcing white masculine norms stems in part from the philosophical foundations on which we've chosen to build. Most work in machine morality is grounded in deontic norms, and in particular, Kantian deontology, which assumes that we have a set of, again, it goes back to Paul's universality, of universal moral principles that we all agree on and agree on how we should behave. We don't talk a lot about the context behind Kant's idea of universal moral norms. The philosopher Charles Mills, as he has analyzed this, and he points out that at the same time that Kant was coming up with his contractarian political and moral philosophies, he was also coming up with his racial hierarchy, which means that when we talk about who are the people who are within whom these norms are universally accepted, it needs to be contextualized in terms of that work. So maybe we wouldn't be having these problems if we were working towards machine morality through a lens that didn't assume a single set of universal moral norms. One alternative I will present, because it is what my lab has worked on, is Confucian role ethics, that we've done a lot of computational, philosophical, and experimental work on. So if you're not familiar with Confucian role ethics, some of its principles, it emphasizes the need for moral cultivation and mutual striving to become good. It emphasizes how virtues are cultivated relationally through our social interactions and relationships. And within Confucian role ethics, we become good by observing the actions of yourself and others through the lens of relational roles, by reflecting on the alignment of those actions and role-based expectations, and by engaging in moral practice by adapting your actions based off of those reflections. So how do we apply this to robotics? Well, we have used it to enable new role-based moral reasoning capabilities in our robots, using role-based moral principles rather than norms as the sort of first line of defense. And moreover, this role-based perspective has forced us to be explicit about key design questions when encoding those moral principles, like what roles and relationships do we want robots to embody? And what virtues do we seek to encourage in those relationships? This role-based perspective encourages us to emphasize moral cultivation and to only engage in moral rebuke when it's in service of moral cultivation. However, a common criticism of sort of Confucianism is the historical emphasis it has had on sort of hierarchical, patriarchal gender norms. And so you could ask, could this just risk trading these sort of white supremacist logics for patriarchal logics? But I think that this could be avoided by taking, again, an explicitly feminist approach to Confucian role ethics. So in future work, we're interested in rethinking hierarchies in this approach by avoiding encoding or enforcing role-based relational principles that are more hierarchical than symmetrical. We are looking at for new ways to embrace pluralism and resist universalization. The work we have done has already sort of been lauded in the feminist robotics community for embracing a non-Western ethics, but I think that a truly morally pluralist perspective might involve encoding normative information in the context of roles and relationships. And again, this is something we've already started working on in past work. And in the future, I also want to engage in more participatory forms of confusion role ethics by working with communities to understand and encode their role-based moral intuitions. Again, using some of the types of approaches we've used in our other work. All right, structural power. Not enough time. Ask me later. Structural power is the domain where I'm actually the most outspoken. We have some of the efforts we've done on the sort of activist front on that side have been covered in the New York Times. I'm not going to talk about it today, though. Ask me later. So, with that said, high-level point here: feminist design frameworks like Winkle's feminist human-robot interaction encourage us to identify and challenge power inequities. This is critical for designing genuinely ethical, responsible, and socially just robots. Frameworks like grounded in Black Feminist Thought, like matrix-guided technology power analysis, help us to identify and formulate responses to specific types of power inequities when used in conversation with those general feminist principles. And I hope overall this talk has inspired you to consider other ways that developers of technologies, robots or otherwise, might be wielding different types of power in inequitable ways, and how those inequitable power dynamics might be most effectively challenged. So finally, thank you to the people who paid for this work, to my great collaborators, to my PhD students and master students who, a few are on the job market right now, and to all the undergrads who I couldn't fit onto this slide. And thank you for having me here to talk about all these wild things. And apologies for talking about that.
Okay, questions?
Oh, I thought that was a hand raise. It was a soda raise.
There was not applause online.
Pluralism.
Yes.
If you make the assumption that robotics is in service of humanity, isn't it just pretty simple to assume that pluralistic approaches to robotics is a given? And it should be obvious in the quote modern age where the world is shrinking and the information age is here. I'm just curious about the practicality of just pursuing a pluralistic approach and letting that be informed by nation state.
So I think that when we're talking about pluralism here, the focus really is on saying we shouldn't be pursuing a single universalizing solution at two levels. One on the types of technological approaches we are choosing to develop, and one on the types of values and moral principles that we are encoding into our robots. So on that first piece of like, is robotics itself an inherently moralistic, pluralistic approach? I don't think so. And this is something that our lab tries to be careful about, of trying to toe the line of, on the one hand, we are a robotics lab, we look for robotic solutions to problems. On the other hand, acknowledging that robots are not always the right solution, and throwing a robot, like putting a robot into that context is not always the right thing to do. So this is something I've recently been in talks with like Denver about developing robots to help new migrants who are coming in, especially from Venezuela, arriving at Union Station like with nothing. Our local stakeholders are really excited about this and want robots. But at the same time, we've sort of had to step back and be like, you know what? We actually don't, as roboticists, we actually don't think that robots are the right solution here, right? And so like being careful about that. Similarly with like our use of teleoperation, like looking at these cases where, yes, historically we're an artificial intelligence oriented lab, and the field is like going full force in that direction. But maybe in this domain where the care wizards, right, really have real need for using teleoperation, maybe that's the right approach. At the other level, what it looks like for us is, again, looking at how can we make sure that we're not only encoding sort of like white Western masculine perspectives into our robots, and how do we make sure that it's not just robot designers who are encoding moral principles into robots, and how can we allow that to be democratized in some way? Yes.
Besides feminism, have you also explored other theories like involved in robotics?
That's a big question, because like, yes, I mean, there are a myriad of different types of perspectives and theories that are from different fields that are informing this approach. Can you elaborate a little bit as to like what axis you're talking about?
Yeah, so I think it was more like in so in design, we also have like feminist design, the type of design that we do in HCI. So I was just wondering if like this approach, because you said like it was a recent paper or no, during pandemic. So before that, what were these other theories that maybe you were exploring or your PhD students were exploring that also were like, as inclusive? Because it feels like the feminist approach brought much more things that were not considered before, but what were these other?
Well, it's complicated about brought more things that was not considered before. Because some of the things that we were doing, we were not thinking about through a feminist perspective. Taking this feminist design lens helped us to understand, helped us better understand how the work we were already doing could fit into that framework, and then what things what were the blind spots now that we had grounded them. So as an example, like the work I talked about in terms of analyzing the ways that robot systems might be reinforcing like racial categories. That is work that honestly I had not been thinking about as a feminist work, and that's work we presented like in maybe even in the same conference session as Katie's feminist design paper. One of the keynote speakers, though, who gave a whole talk on feminism in design, he's a Swedish feminist scholar, pointed at our work and said, actually, no, like this, it's not framed as feminist design, but like this is like a really good example of embodiment of these types of principles. And that sort of forced us to go back and sort of rethink that work. I think that historically, our lab had tried to, we were doing a lot of participatory design work, a lot of co-design work, but weren't necessarily viewing that through the lens of this sort of overarching framework. And doing so is really helping us to push forward, not just to understand, you know, what we were doing right, but thinking about what these holes are of where we can go next.
Yeah.
Okay, Tammy raised her hand.
Hey, Tom, thank you for that. I didn't know some of that, as you call it, ancient history. That was fascinating. But my question follows from what you were just talking about. You know, when you're doing design work, you have a lot of this guidance that's generated from your theory, your feminist theory, and then you have this really ground up guidance that's generated from your work, your participatory work with stakeholders. And the two can be in conflict.
Yeah.
So how do you navigate the tensions arising from the organic work with stakeholders and the top-down ideas arising from theory?
That's a great question. So I guess there's two different levels to this, right? The first, it's that like the theory can like precede and follow those types of activities. So like in the first, the types of participatory work with stakeholders, like in the first place, can be guided and motivated by those types of principles, right? However, yes, you are right that there can be an inherent tension where stakeholders might tell you things that might conflict with your theory. Or there's been actually a lot written recently about like limitations of participatory design and about like participation washing, right? Of whether like tech companies might be able to like go into some of these like their design efforts, like plaster a participatory veneer over what they're doing, and then end up with things with end products that are actually genuinely harming those communities for various reasons. And so at least in terms of what our lab is doing, our current mindset is that we are going to try to take these participatory approaches, listen to what the stakeholders have to say, but then be careful about taking it at face value, and then try to see where it might be in alignment or not in alignment with our core values that we want to embody. One area with this is, like, again, if you are asking people how they think the robot should behave, right, how the robot should respond, you can do that in a way where, well, we're going to sit down, we're going to listen with people, we're going to see what they have to say, but then you have to understand that it's likely that the things that are saying, especially if you're not careful about, like, specifically who you are working with, they might be saying that because it aligns with certain pre-existing biases, and so there is a tension here of wanting to go off of what these stakeholders tell us, while also being clear about our own principles and making sure that we're staying true to them. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's a hard dance, and I appreciate your thoughtful reply, Tom. Thank you.
The screen show from Zoom.
Yes. Here. Let's see.
I didn't know that was Tammy until I just saw her.
Is that nope. Oops.
There are two screens, maybe. you
Yes,
can do that.
that's
No, that's screen.
screen mirroring. Mirror.
All right,
There you
all right, Tammy.
There we go.
You can see, yes, yes.
I'll ask a follow-on.
Yeah.
Before I do, though, I
Mhm.
just want to say I really appreciate your presentation, the depth and thoughtfulness. It's just filled with tons of information. This is sort of the second question, though. Assuming you get it right on this is a good place for robotics, this is a bad place. Just talk really briefly, I know it's a big topic, but talk briefly about what HRI and others in general are doing to build that absolutely must-have list of measurements and metrics and, statistics that are going to be the key to getting it pretty good. That is to say, matching up to a human being that walks up in front of a robot for interaction. That's a sort of a curiosity, if there is such a list being created by manufacturers or researchers.
Sorry. Okay. So just make sure I understood the question, because I thought it was going in one direction, that I think it. Thinking about beyond the scope of sort of what I talked about,
Right.
what are the key measures and metrics that we use in human-robot interactions?
It's really simple.
Yep.
It's just that, and think of yourself as being a manufacturer and wanting to have good product.
Yep.
And good integration and, pluralistic, capability.
Yep. So I think that there's sort of two pieces to this. In terms of a lot of the things I talked about today, I don't necessarily know that these are well aligned with measures and metrics. This is more about about the field's efforts to to shape who is on our robot design teams, what our design processes look like, who we are listening to in the design process, and so forth. Beyond that, there's this additional step of, well, what are the measures and metrics we actually use in order to determine whether this is an effective robot design? And yeah, there are, like, in the human robot interaction community, there's groups of researchers from, like, NIST who study this about what are, like, the most precise ways that we can measure this. And it's a mixture of objective metrics that are oriented around task performance, and subjective measures around, again, like measuring human robot trust through, like, well-validated scales. One of the things my lab is working on is, like, we have an Air Force project on developing new scales for measuring how people perceive the autonomy, interactivity, and adaptability of robotic systems, which is important for understanding, like, at a deeper level, how people establish trust in these systems. Neurophysiological and other types of physiological measures provide other additional deeper levels of analysis. And then also people look at things like, how closely do people choose to stand to the robot, which says something both about trust, and it says something about social presence, and all these things still really important and help to guide the design, to understand how good our robot designs are. But need to be preceded by this type of careful reflection as to how we're going about doing this design work, and need to be followed by saying, well, these are the, you know, what people are telling us. Is it possible that there are certain ways that, you know, that those metrics might be reflecting certain underlying norms that we don't actually want to optimize for?
Great answer. I'll just continue by maybe putting some boundaries on it.
Yeah.
Saying what you did was start with me saying, hey, maybe there's a list that pushes aside that first
Mhm.
layer. You know, if you get enough things in that list and they pay attention to what's in that list,
Yep.
all those other biases can sort of fall by the wayside. That would be a wonderful thing. I doubt it'll happen, but then the next step is application layer,
Mhm.
where you're trying to, you know, pursue a mission with the application. And,
Yes.
and that further defines it. So it's very interesting and lot of degrees of freedom.
It depends so much on the application domain,
Right.
what we care about in like, if we're developing, like we've done work, our lab does some work on like robots for space exploration, and we have some work for like robots for therapists working with kids, right? And like radically different ways that we need to evaluate those types of work.
I'll just say one last thing. I just love the fact that you can start to get a sort of a problem space sense, just how complex and nuanced the problem is. And if there is some sort of future framework that will come up for people in the
Mhm.
robotics industry. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Fascinating talk. I've got two questions. I'll ask the simpler and more obvious one. We'll save the more complex one for the two-beer conversation. Nothing about us without us. Your team is demographically skewed in certain directions and absent in other directions, your research team. So are you working with, or how do you work with, or how would you work with communities who have stake in this but might not be represented on your understandably academic PhD level team?
Yeah, so I mean, the shorter answer to that is that we do not work on projects that we do not have the representation to meaningfully engage with. So the work that we did on like trans non-binary perspectives, we would not have pursued that if Mike was not on the team. In terms of like issues of race, for example, you'll notice that a lot of the things that we engaged with on the race side was more like philosophical in nature, more commentary. We haven't done as much on the design side, and that is in part because like we have several members of our lab who are Hispanic or Latino, but we don't currently have any Black students in our lab, for example. There's a 95% chance a Black woman will be joining my lab next year, and she's excited about working on some of those projects. So some of this is to say that the research we do is in part guided by the people who are already in the lab. I don't know if that answers the.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Last question before lunch.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a weird, fun question, but
Perfect.
so I know there is some artistic work around like radical or revolutionary robotics. It seems like most of your work is intending to like challenge or be cautious of bias. I wonder if you have an opinion or a position on robotics that are like more challenging the existing status quo. Does that make sense?
Well, because you started by saying like work in the artistic space, and that makes me think that you're talking about some specific.
I mean, I am aware of artists who have created like racially critical work, for
Yeah.
instance. But again, that's like mostly an expression or like a provocation.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anyone who's like practically producing revolutionary robotics. I just like, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering.
So, okay, I guess there's a space here, right?
Yeah.
There is some of the type of work that like we've been working on like cross-stereotypic design, which is subverting existing design trends, but maybe not it's still like within the vision of types of robots that we would want to deploy soon. On the other hand, you've got things, there have been some like robot art installations that have tried to explicitly challenge some of these things. There was a video at HRI last year where people designed this like very hypersexualized female robot that would go and like it was deployed at an event and went and like hit on people. And like in a way that would be more like according to cultural norms, be more expected of a man to do, but like not of women. I don't know how I feel about that, right? Like it feels like really easy to backfire. I've talked with, one of my friends from college a couple of years ago was like, the nominated for the Pulitzer in drama. And he does a lot of work on, like the play he was nominated for was like engaging with issues of artificial intelligence and gender and things like that. So we've talked a little bit about certain ways that we might be able to engage in this in maybe a more sensitive way. So like I showed a picture of the fur hat robot that is a retro projected face. It can change its presentation. And we've thought about certain ways that we might have like art installations where the robot is changing its identity in a fluid way that like forces people to engage with some of these types of questions. But again, it's something where I think I would only do that if either people with the right sort of combination of demographic background and or an artistic interest on the team together, and would want to be very careful about it, because I've seen the examples where I'm like, I know what you were going for, but I'm not actually sure if this was like a appropriate and sensitive thing to do. So I'm very interested in exploring that space, but need to be careful.